The Viscount Deception, a sweet Regency romance adventure. Mayfair Mayhem, Book 3. Written by Wendy May Andrews. Narrated by Julie Hinton. Chapter 1. Watching the young woman circle the room in the arms of some aristocratic gentleman whose name he could not at the moment recall, caused Wesley's ire to rise at an unreasonable rate. He knew he shouldn't feel so angry with her. She was just like nearly every other young woman in attendance, but unlike the other young women in attendance, she had tried to entrap his best friend into marriage so an amoral villain could gain control of the young Duke, and that fact was what had Wesley so uncharacteristically angry. As he stood on the sidelines of the dance floor watching the debutantes and dandies, it crossed Wesley's mind that he really ought to leave. Feeling as he did, he doubted he would be able to make socially acceptable conversation that evening. Just as he was thinking that, as luck would have it, Lady Anne and her dance partner came to a stop right in front of him as the music slowed to silence momentarily. Wesley gritted his teeth and forced himself to smile politely as they bowed and curtsied to one another. As the small orchestra struck up the next number, Wesley was shocked to hear his own voice asking, "Might I have the honour of this dance, my lady?" The young woman nearly simpered as she dipped into a curtsy to him and accepted his proffered hand. "I would be delighted, my lord." Wesley had to fight not to roll his eyes. He really wanted to walk away without dancing with her. He could not, for the life of him, fathom what had come over him to ask the wench to dance. He doubted it were within his power to be civil for the required 4 or 5 minutes that he would have to be in her company. Because, of course, it was not a country dance that would have given them breaks from each other as the steps were performed. No, it was a minuet. He would be stuck with the chit in his arms for a minimum of 4 minutes. He would have cheerfully lopped off his tongue in that moment, if it would allow him to take back his impulsive words. Racking his brain for something innocuous to discuss, Wesley was at a loss when Lady Anne surprised him by asking the last thing he would have expected her to bring up. "Have you spoken to either Miss Smythe or the Duke of Wrentham?" Wesley felt his hands tighten on her, and saw the flicker of alarm cross her features. He could tell she was nervous. The young woman usually gave the appearance of a mouse, and while she still looked timid, he could see she was making every effort not to quail under what he was certain was a rather fierce glare from him. Striving for a steady tone, Wesley asked, "Why would you ask me that?" "Miss Smythe was one of the few women who seemed genuinely friendly towards me since I have come up to London with my father for the season, so I wish her all the best. I do not know any details, but from something my father said to me, I know that she has encountered a bit of difficulty. I feel that I am somehow involved because of my father and his associate, so I thought to ask you if you know anything." Wesley was struck with a torrent of conflicting feelings. He was quite aware the nervous young lady was making an effort to be brave, and a small part of him wanted to applaud her attempt, but the rest of him was furious that she would even dare to bring it up. She had brought a threat to 2 of his dearest friends, and that was not something he would readily forgive. He heard the iciness in his tone and had no regrets as he answered her. "I have absolutely no desire to discuss this particular topic with you, my lady." Her blue gaze dropped from his for a moment, as a not unbecoming blush spread across her features. The Viscount watched with a measure of appreciation as she took a deep breath and stunned him once again by meeting his eyes valiantly and boldly asking, "Why not?" There was an infinitesimal pause before she added, Wesley suspected sarcastically, "My lord?" Now he had to fight the urge to laugh at her obvious irritation. It was like watching a kitten getting mad at a guard dog. "Considering that any trouble my friends might be facing at the moment arrived at their doorstep via an association with you, I do not think you have any right to information about them at this juncture." Wesley could hear just how pompous he sounded, but found he didn't care in the least. He waited to see how she would react to his statement. Again, her eyes shifted away guiltily, and her cheeks maintained their high colour. He suspected she was wishing herself elsewhere, but she did not cave in. After another deep breath, she again dragged her gaze back to meet his, valiantly attempting to maintain her composure. "I am not in the custom of contradicting gentlemen, even when they are wrong, but I find that I shall have to make an exception this time, my lord." Her tone was so shy and nervous that Wesley almost missed the meaning of her words. Swallowing a chuckle that threatened to emerge over her effrontery, Wesley forced himself to stare coldly into a timid blue gaze. "Was that convoluted statement supposed to mean that you think I am wrong?" Watching her swallow nervously, but hold his gaze while she nodded, Wesley began to feel like a bully for confronting her, but he was not yet prepared to back down from his position. "I hardly think you are in any position to correct me, my lady. As you said, because of your father and his associate, and their use of you to further their ends, trouble found my friends. I think you ought to leave it at that, and be relieved that you have been preserved from feeling any consequences." Wesley felt his first inkling of concern in that moment, as her eyes flared with what he would have thought was anger on someone else. But he doubted the mousy Lady Anne ever felt anything that fierce in her life. "You know nothing of my life, my lord. But you are quite correct. I am not in any position to censure you. Please forget that I asked, and let us merely enjoy the last moments of this lovely dance." Contrarily, her mild acceptance of his refusal made Wesley want to discuss the matter further. Recognizing the musicians were bringing the minuet to a close, Wesley did the unthinkable. Bowing to his partner, he kept a firm hold on her hand. "Please, allow me to escort you to the refreshment room." Anne gazed at him in amazement. The irritating man had just seconds prior appeared to heartily wish to be rid of her. Now he seemed eager to prolong their interlude. Shaking her head, Anne once again arrived at the conclusion that men were irrational creatures. She tried to tug her hand from his grasp, but his grip was firm. "I am perfectly fine on my own, thank you, my lord." She tried to make her tone severe, but doubted she had succeeded, when he merely graced her with a benign smile and tucked her hand in his elbow. Not wishing to draw attention to herself, Anne was forced to allow the insufferable man to keep her at his side. She knew she ought to be grateful. If word of the situation she had been trying to discuss with him ever got out, the fact that she had been seen in his company would help dispel any rumours of her involvement. She knew that Ton would not suspect her of any involvement if Lord Dunbar, the Viscount of Bracondale, was seen as being friendly with her. It was well known amongst the Ton how deep the friendship of the Viscount of Bracondale and the Duke of Wrentham went. She tried not to be jealous. She would love to have that kind of friendship with someone, or anyone. Of course, she had her dog, she reminded herself with a stab of homesickness. She missed the hairy sheepdog, and wished she had been able to bring him to London, but her aunt wouldn't have allowed the hairy dog into the house. Too, Anne missed the lovely, loyal servants who remained on their run-down estate, despite the irregularity of their wages. She hadn't meant to let it out, but her soft sigh must have been audible as the Viscount turned his sharp gaze on her. "Am I walking too fast for you, my lady?" She didn't trust his solicitous tone, but answered him truthfully nonetheless. "My thoughts were elsewhere, my lord. I am perfectly able to keep up, have no fear." Anne almost smiled over the quizzical glance he cast her way, before continuing toward the punch bowl. She remained at his side while they each accepted a glass of punch from the attentive servant. Just as she was about to take a sip, she felt the Viscount tug her toward a vacant alcove. She was glad she hadn't managed to swallow anything, as she would have no doubt choked with surprise as he said, Let us take a seat over there for a moment."
"Whatever for, my lord? Surely you wish to be rid of me at the earliest opportunity?"
She pointed out what she thought was a reasonable statement. "Not at all, my dear. Why would you say something so preposterous?" Now, Anne actually felt genuine amusement for the first time in longer than she wished to remember, days at least, if not weeks.
"Because you refuse to answer the one question I most want to have answered. And your explanation for said refusal left little doubt in my mind that you have no wish to prolong your association with me."
Despite her discomfort, Anne could not hold her tongue. It was most unusual for her. She was used to being silent and keeping her few thoughts to herself. The Viscount of Bracondale had a most distressing effect on her. She really ought to insist that he allow her to return to the ballroom. Her intent must have been written upon her features, because just as she was about to turn away from the chairs he was clearly guiding her toward, she felt the Viscount's grasp tighten upon her elbow. "Please, my lady, might I have just a few more minutes of your time?" Anne found that she could not resist when the handsome lord turned such a sincere look upon her. She was quite certain the sincerity was feigned, but she allowed him to guide her to the seat he had indicated. Gazing at him while she sipped her punch, Anne could see the hard look return to the Viscount's face. She stifled another sigh. She should have known this was not going to be a pleasant interlude. A wave of longing for the simple life she had led with her father on their decaying estate swept through her, but she hurried to suppress the melancholy thoughts. As her father had pointed out to her, the estate was about to fall down around their ears. She had little hope of returning there. If she did not manage to contract an advantageous marriage, she was going to have to throw herself upon the charity of her relatives in order to have a roof over her head. She really ought to be making an effort to turn the Viscount up sweet. Rumour had it he was one of the wealthiest of the aristocratic bachelors. But looking into his cold, hard face, Anne could not muster any enthusiasm for the thought. Looking around the room at the other milling guests, Anne tried to push all concerned thoughts from her mind and merely waited to hear what the Viscount might next have to say. "How can you sit there as though you have not a care in the world, my lady?" Wesley heard the exasperation in his tone, but didn't care. He could not understand this woman in the least. Either she was a simpleton, or she was a renowned actress. Neither was an acceptable option. He watched in surprise as another delicate blush rose in her cheeks, but she lifted one shoulder in a negligent shrug. "I do not choose to acknowledge my cares while I am in public, my lord. It really would not be polite to have a fit of hysterics in the middle of a ball." At this, Wesley lost control of his amusement and actually chuckled at her words, causing a few heads to turn and regard them curiously. He watched in fascination as the colour in her cheeks disappeared for a brief moment, and then flooded back darker than before. "My lord!" Her tone was scolding, but she said nothing else, merely gazing at him with a mixture of horror and fascination. Wesley's laughter disappeared, and they sat there in silence regarding each other seriously for a brief moment. He broke the strained silence. "Why do you really want to know about Alex and Rose?" "I told you, my lord. I am concerned for Miss Smythe. I know there is nothing I could possibly do to help either of them, but I was actually hoping for reassurance that they shall be fine." Her eyes didn't quite meet his, so Wesley doubted she was telling him the entire truth. He decided to probe the subject further. He could see that she was uncomfortable being in his presence, and hoped that would prompt her to reveal something she would have otherwise kept to herself. "What do you know of their situation?" he prompted. "Very little, my lord. I really have no wish to discuss this with you. Could you just, please, tell me if Miss Smythe is all right?" Wesley resisted the prodding of his conscience and his 28 years of training as a gentleman. I really do not feel as though I ought to tell you anything, my lady."
"Then why did you bother to prolong our time together?"
Despite her obvious discomfort, she did not resist questioning him. Wesley rewarded her flash of bravery with honesty. "I really have no idea. I am intensely angry with you for the trouble you have brought upon them. It is the first time in my life that I have ever felt this way about a lady, and I do not know quite how to handle it." He was surprised to see her blinking at him as though he had lost his mind. There was another brief silence before his surprise deepened when she spoke.
"As I said before, my lord, I hesitate to contradict you, but I did not bring the trouble upon them. I may have been briefly a tool involved in this trouble, but I do believe Miss Smythe brought the trouble upon herself by getting involved in a matter that was not actually any of her business."
There was another pause as she appeared to gather her composure and courage before continuing.
"Now, would you please tell me if they are all right?"
Wesley regarded the female in front of him as though she were a curiosity at the fair. He could not make sense of her. It was obvious to him that she was terrified, but she refused to cower. He felt a kernel of respect start to germinate in his chest, but shoved that to the back of his mind. He decided he'd had enough of this particular conversation. He really ought not to have made any attempt to talk to the woman while he was unable to completely control his fuming anger. He took note of the fact that she had finished her glass of punch. He stood abruptly and grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet beside him and curling her hand around his elbow. "They shall be just fine," he finally answered curtly. "Now, shall I return you to the ballroom?" He felt her intent gaze burning into the side of his head, but he refused to meet her eyes, merely guiding her through the throngs of people as they headed in the direction of the music. Before she quite knew what was happening, the Viscount was bowing over her hand and taking his leave of her. Anne felt almost bereft as the Viscount walked away, which was ridiculous considering how haughtily he had treated her. She felt a crease of worry forming between her brows as she gazed at his retreating back. This would just not do. Smoothing the frown away with effort, Anne forced her thoughts to pleasant ones, and her eyes back to the dance floor as another young man came to ask her to dance. With relief, she took his hand and stepped into the lively quadrille. As she made her way through the familiar steps, she had the eerie feeling that someone was watching her. Ensuring that she kept her place in the dance, Anne allowed her gaze to dart about the dance floor in an attempt to ascertain who it might be. She almost tripped as her gaze collided with that of the Viscount of Bracondale. "Why is the infuriating man watching me?" she wondered with exasperation. Recovering her composure, she smiled pleasantly at a dance partner and forced her concentration on the steps while her mind scurried around the many questions plaguing her. Her current dance partner was bowing over her hand just as Lord Spencer approached her. "My dear Lady Anne, would you do me the honour of sharing this next dance with me? It sounds as though they are striking up the waltz." Anne felt warmth climb into her cheeks. She was quite aware there were many who questioned whether the waltz should be allowed in polite company. She had only danced it a handful of times herself. She could tell the Earl was waiting for her reaction. With an unconscious defiant lift of her chin, Anne put her hand in the Earl's outstretched one.
"I would be delighted,"
she replied, her polite tone not revealing how much she was looking forward to the dance. Lord Spencer, the Earl of Sutton, was rumoured to be a skilled dance partner, but she had not yet had the pleasure of dancing with him herself. She tried not to get her hopes up about a potential match. The Earl of Sutton would be a remarkably good catch, but she didn't feel any snag of excitement as she stepped into his arms, despite the intimacy forced upon them by the waltz. It was strange. She had never thought that was important, until the thrill she had felt in the Viscount's arms. As she circled the dance floor, She thought back to the conversation she'd had with Rose and another friend about the need to have love in marriage. While it was not strictly necessary, she knew quite well, it was a thought she was having difficulty getting out of her mind ever since that conversation. She had previously never considered the possibility of making a love match. It was rarely done in their circles, was even looked upon with a level of derision. But ever since the idea had been planted in her head, Anne had struggled uprooting it. "So, what were you and Bracondale arguing about during your dance?" Anne was startled out of her disquieting thoughts by the Earl's question. She scrambled for an acceptable answer. "I do not have any idea what you are talking about, my lord. Neither the Viscount nor I would do something so ill-bred as to argue in a crowded ballroom." To her surprise, the Earl graced her with a charming grin. "I suppose you are right. He always was rather fastidious about such things, but I must tell you, I have known him since we were boys, and it looked to me as though he wanted to argue with you, even if you were both too polite to do so." There was a brief pause while Anne looked at the Earl with dismay, and he watched her with careful assessment. It piqued my curiosity, I must say. Anne tilted her head in order to study his face carefully. It took her a moment to process his last statement, but when she did, it took considerable effort not to burst into laughter. "Do I understand you to mean that you became highly interested in dancing with me when you thought that perhaps your friend wanted to argue with me?" At his nod, she allowed a grin to crease her face. "Might I be so bold as to ask why?" The Earl shrugged and graced her with another grin of his own. "Like I said, I have known Bracondale for eons, since we were boys. Obviously you don't know him that well, or you would understand. The man is of a ridiculously sunny temperament. When we were boys, he would invariably find the bright side to look upon. It could be intolerably annoying when all you wanted to do was be angry about something. So, to see him looking on the verge of temper was a novel experience that must be explored. And since it would appear that it was directed towards you, I thought I would begin my investigation right here." Feeling genuine amusement with the Earl's statement, but mistrusting the calculating gleam in his eyes, Anne merely offered a shrug of her own. "I cannot enlighten you, my lord. As I said, we did not argue. I cannot begin to fathom what his lordship might have been thinking. You shall simply have to ask him yourself." She hoped her face didn't give away how nervous he made her, as his eyes narrowed speculatively on her face, although she doubted much escaped the sharp-eyed Earl of Sutton. Anne was relieved a moment later when he gave a decisive nod, as though declaring he was going to take her word for it, at least for the moment. But then he proceeded to confound her with his next question. "Why is this the first time we have danced, my lady? You are an excellent dancer, and reasonably pretty. I am certain I ought to have danced with you before now." Anne couldn't help the gasp of laughter that escaped her at these unanswerable words. "I am unsure how to reply to such a statement, my lord." "Oh, my dear, have I said something offensive? I have yet to learn to leash my wretched tongue." No, you did not offend me, my lord. Have no fear. In the way of answering your question, I have not been in town over long. Perhaps we have just not attended the same events. Have you been here for the entire season?" "I have. I am remarkably devoted to taking my seat in the House of Lords. That, of course, coincides with the season, and as it seems I am always trying to convince someone to take my side on a particular argument, I have to attend his wife's ball or rout or whatever nonsense in order to gain his agreement." Anne blinked at him for a moment before asking, "So what are you trying to get Lord Hudson to agree to, my lord?" The Earl grinned. "Well, I certainly couldn't entrust that sort of information to someone not involved, now could I?" Feeling disgruntled, Anne grumbled,
You are the one who brought it up, my lord.
You are quite correct, and I apologize, my lady. That was not well done of me, was it? Now tell me, how have you been enjoying your first season? Anne admired his skilled change of subject. Despite his occasional lack of tact, it was obvious he was firmly in control of his own social discourses. Her own proper upbringing forced her to politely answer his question.
It has certainly had its ups and downs, my lord. It has not quite turned out as I had expected.
What had you been expecting?
Anne wished he had asked her about the weather rather than about the season. She was unused to prevaricating, but doubted he would appreciate her full honesty. I hadn't expected the crowds, and the noise. I had no idea there would be quite so many people. I rather think I had not given the entire experience sufficient thought, to be honest, my lord. I naively thought I could show up, receive an offer of marriage, and carry on with my life comfortably.
To Anne's chagrin, Lord Spencer chuckled again, although, thankfully, this time he kept his volume low, and it did not draw the eyes of others in the room. As Anne had pointed out, the vast crowds did tend to produce a great deal of noise. No one had noticed his laughter. How long have you been here, my lady?
2.5 weeks. And you thought you would already be heading off to your husband's estate by now?
His incredulous tone brought heat to her cheeks, and Anne realized she had managed to reveal her foolishness. She gritted her teeth and tried to brazen it out. This evening can hardly get worse, she thought with a touch of desperation.
Clearly I was mistaken,
she managed in a tone that, with relief, sounded unconcerned to her own ears. Lord Spencer's sharp gaze was still focused on her face, but then his attention glided over her shoulder, and his expression altered.
Tell me, Lady Anne, why the Viscount is still watching you?
It took every ounce of willpower she possessed not to crane around to see what the Earl was looking at. Keeping her face as impassive as she could muster, Anne answered him as neutrally as possible.
I have no idea what you are talking about, my lord. My father is a Viscount. Is that who you are talking about? It would be reasonable for him to keep an eye on me. Would you not agree?
Your father is not the Viscount I meant, my dear. Surely you realize that. Again the Earl of Sutton was looking at her as though he wished to read her mind. Anne was overcome with relief when she heard the music dying away.
Thank you for the dance, my lord. It was pleasant.
She kept her tone bland, and was turning away when her relief died a quick death. The Viscount of Bracondale was standing next to them, and appeared as though he were waiting for her. "I believe this next dance is promised to me," the Viscount declared. Without waiting for her reply, he swept her back onto the dance floor. Wesley could see consternation glowing in the depths of Anne's eyes, but she managed to keep a serene expression on her face. He was beginning to suspect she was not nearly as empty-headed as she let on. "What did you and Sutton discuss?" he asked, trying to sound as though he were making idle chit-chat.
"I do believe we were discussing you, my lord,"
Anne answered, her tone slightly breathless. "You aren't certain one way or the other?" Wesley demanded.
"The Earl strikes me as being a trifle strange, my lord. I do apologize for saying so, as he told me the two of you are particular friends, so I hesitate to insult a close companion of yours, but the encounter was decidedly peculiar."
"Why do you say that, my lady?" Wesley's curiosity was truly piqued, and he was looking forward to the insight into her character. His fascination only increased as he watched the blush climb in her cheeks once more. He chastised himself briefly. He really ought to leave the poor woman alone. She was obviously unused to such attentions.
"He seemed to be strangely fascinated with our previous dance, my lord."
She paused for a moment, clearly reluctant to continue, But while he maintained his silence, she plunged on. Wesley was surprised to find her clear gaze looking at him straight in the eye as she demanded, "Are the two of you in some sort of competitive game involving me? I do not understand why you would each be questioning me about my conversation with the other." Wesley realized with a slight start that the young woman in his arms was beginning to look angry. He felt the fast stirrings of intrigue. She was quite obviously not the mousy little creature he had taken her to be. While she presented a facade of being a meekly acquiescent daughter to a broken-down father, Wesley could see there really was a backbone hidden inside her delicate frame. He called himself to attention and addressed her question quickly when he saw the sparkle of tears brighten her eyes. "No, no, of course not, my dear Lady Anne. I apologize profusely for giving you that impression. The Earl and I have been friends since we were young lads at school. We have been like brothers since our young years. Like any brothers, we have a history of pulling pranks upon one another, but we also have always been fiercely loyal to one another. The Duke of Wrentham was one of our brethren. Sutton was, no doubt, like me, concerned over your possible connection with that trouble." He watched with interest as Anne's gaze turned guilty for a moment, but then she met his eyes frankly. "I have my doubts about that, my lord, as he did not make any reference to the Duke. He seemed to be much more interested in you and whatever you and I had been discussing." Wesley suppressed a sigh. He was getting nowhere. He could not fathom how he had gotten so off course that evening. He'd had no intention of confronting Lady Anne, and then once he had, he was bewildered how the conversation had gotten so off course. He had been unable to hold on to his justifiable anger at the young woman. It was as though she had cast a spell over him, he thought rather dazedly. She would bear watching, he determined. He could almost feel her discomfort as she valiantly met his eyes. Wesley forced himself to ignore the shaft of guilt that speared through him as he attempted to fan the flames of his anger toward her. He watched in fascination as her blue eyes widened as she continued to meet his glare. For a brief moment, her gaze dropped from his, but then it swept back and her pointy little chin lifted in a slight but defiant tilt. Once again, Wesley had to fight not to laugh over the imagery of a kitten standing up to the guard dog that flashed through his mind at her refusal to cower before him. It was blatantly obvious to him how difficult it was for her to stand her ground. She was doing so in an understated way that many might not even notice, but he could see it, and he found it surprisingly, profoundly attractive. He shoved the unwelcome thought from his mind and scowled at her. Anne felt the colour ebb and flow from her cheeks. Her nerves made her almost light-headed, and she could not understand why she was fighting him. Of course, other women would probably fight harder or louder, but for her, this was a fight, and it made absolutely no sense to her. Why should I fight the Viscount of Bracondale? She wondered almost wildly. In that moment, she decided to give up. There was no logical sense to the strange situation. She was in London to find a husband. It was as simple as that. She did not want a husband who glared at her for something she did not do, so the Viscount was not on the list of potential mates. So this thing, whatever it was, that was happening this evening, was an unwelcome distraction on her path to a secure future. Her resolve firmly bolstered, Anne plastered a serene expression upon her face, and offered the Viscount a tentative smile. Part of her felt like giggling over the suspicious look that crossed the nobleman's face, but she quickly squashed the ridiculous notion. She silently offered up a prayer that the dance would soon be over. Profound relief spread over her as she heard the music drawing to a conclusion. Just as she was wondering how to dismiss the Viscount, she spotted her aunt waiting for her on the side of the dance floor. "Thank you for the dance, my lord. I can see that my aunt is looking for me. Perhaps it is time for us to depart." Allow me to escort you to her side." His haughty tone set her teeth on edge, but she merely offered him a benign smile. Anne wondered if she needed to introduce the Viscount to her aunt. It seemed to her that the members of the ton all knew each other in some mysterious way, but it was proper to perform introductions nonetheless. She was relieved from this one worry when the Viscount bowed elegantly over her aunt's hand. "My dear Lady Sophie, it is a pleasure to see you again. You look to be in fine health and looking lovely as always this evening. And how is your husband?" "Oh, my lord, you are such a flatterer, you young scamp. We are both well, thank you for asking. We are having a grand time escorting my niece around the events of the season. How lovely that the two of you have met." Anne could hardly believe it. Her usually prosaic aunt was practically simpering over the Viscount's attentions. Her jaw nearly became unhinged over the Viscount's next words. "It has been my pleasure meeting your niece. In fact, I was wondering if I might have the pleasure of escorting her for the promenade in the park tomorrow afternoon." A buzzing began in her ears, and Anne almost missed her aunt's reply. Of course, the delight plastered all over her face was really answer enough, Anne thought, while fighting a fit of hysterics. What is the Viscount up to? She wondered frantically, as she used every ounce of her willpower to maintain her composure. She was in a bewildered haze as she watched his retreating back for a brief moment. Not wanting to appear as a love-struck sot, she turned her attention back to her aunt. She regretted that choice as soon as her aunt opened her mouth. "How very exciting, my dear! The Viscount of Bracondale! You could do far worse than him. If the rumours are true, his coffers are so deep, even your father wouldn't be able to run through them in what is left of his lifetime." Anne had no reply for such a statement. Her throat spasmed painfully as she struggled to contain her feelings of revulsion. Anne's aunt didn't seem to notice that Anne did not appear overjoyed at the prospect of entertaining a visit with the Viscount on the morrow. "This is perfect, my dear. The Viscount of Bracondale." She repeated his name again, as though it were an invocation. Anne's stomach turned, and she wondered miserably how much longer it would be before she could seek her bed. As though she had read her niece's mind, her aunt finally looked at her. "You look a trifle peaked, my dear. I think we ought to get you home to bed. It would not do to be overly tired for your ride with the Viscount tomorrow. Come along, my dear. I shall have a footman fetch your uncle and have the carriage called for. Let us go and take our leave of our hostess." Anne followed dully in her aunt's wake, as she wondered how her life had gotten so dreadfully off course.